Hey, this StarCraft 2 history is going to be a quick one. It's going to be about a narrative that had been running through StarCraft 2 from its inception. It's called The Elephant in the Room. It's an article by Intrigue on teamliquid.net. You can read it yourself. But the article doesn't actually matter because it kind of spawned a bunch of narratives that don't necessarily have to do with the article. But there's two big ones that do come out of it. The first one is the idea of the KeSPA training regime that was going to build up a bunch of these players and dominate StarCraft 2. A true point. And the reason this was a narrative was because the KeSPA scene did not transfer over at the inception of StarCraft 2, but instead continued on to play Brood War. And the leftovers from the Brood War scene, like a bunch of the worst players, and then the only really good player was MVP. Had transferred over to StarCraft 2 to play that. But beyond that, like the rest of them weren't that good, but they're still dominating the scene. So the idea was like once KeSPA comes over and their practice machine comes in, and it's a very destructive practice machine. I actually don't think it's very healthy in any sense of the word, but it does. I'll give it credit. It does bang out amazing fucking players that like burn out fucking fast, but were amazing at their peaks of strength. So that's one of the narratives that spawns out of the article. The article itself talks about it, but basically, I think that's the true narrative, so to speak. That's actually the real thing that's going to happen. And then the false narrative that kind of springs out from the article, that's kind of implied in the article, but it's not necessarily what it's talking about, is the idea of the S rank players coming over to dominate as they did in StarCraft and as they did in Brood War. So we're going to talk about like guys like Flash, Bisu, Stork, Jaedong. And the reason it's kind of like a false narrative is obviously, first off, there were very few players, or not players, but very few people who are analyzing both Brood War and StarCraft 2 and could analyze those players and they can come up with an idea reason as to why they would dominate in StarCraft 2 as they did in Brood War. They kind of just looked at the builds like, oh, Brood War, much harder game, much more tactical game, much more strategic game, much more mechanical game on every front. I don't see why they wouldn't dominate StarCraft 2. The problem was StarCraft 2 is a very different type of game. I can call the races Zerg, Terran, Protoss, but they don't in any way match up with the counter equivalents in Brood War. Like the only like similar matchup is basically TVT, and that's it, right? So that's not something anybody was really thinking about, and obviously it's just a guess, and it was a very fun thing to talk about back in the day, just because people like to argue, people like to like theory craft, people like to talk about uh amazing like mythological players in a sense like Flash and Jaedong. And these two narratives basically come up in two different tournaments. The first is at MLG Spring, where they have this giant KeSPA exhibition where they have a bunch of the big name KeSPA pros come over and play, and it basically turns out to be like a false sense of hype because those were not the guys that were going to be dominating the scene from then forth. Yeah, Flash had a pretty good 2013. He had some spikes in his career, but overall he ended up being not as good as people hyped him up to be as like the Lord and Savior of StarCraft 2. Jaedong had a very great 2013, but then he kind of burned out or kind of like went completely average. Stork I have a lot of respect for, but it's like he didn't have very many results to his name. Bisu, he couldn't use a force field to save his life, and if you can't use a force field, why are you playing Protoss? So that kind of covers that. As for the other one, the one that nobody remembers, it's the Pro League Finals of 2012 to 2013 between two two teams that were not particularly popular in a mall. And yes, the Pro League Finals back then was in a mall, so it was very underhyped. But between them, they had Sulky and SOS and Wounding Stars, and then Classic, Innovation, Trap, and Deer on SDX Soul. So definitely, like you see, just between those two teams, they had like 6 upcoming champions that were going to take over Heart of the Swarm, basically. Maybe not so much Trap. That's been extending it, but he's definitely an underrated player and a good player. So in that sense, the elephant in the room turned out to be both true and false. And the reason I'm talking about this is because this becomes a very important idea to talk about when you're going to talk about the end of 2012 to 2013, in a sense, because people kind of overblew the KeSPA hype. And what I mean by that is, yeah, the mid tier, the high tier, even like the top tier, that's all going to get buffed, and majority of those players are probably going to be from KeSPA, right? Because of the practice regime and all that. But there's always going to be players that were before that were still going to stay competitive, still going to fight back, still going to win big titles. Like, for instance, in like the first GSL season, in the second GSL season, basically Bomber, who had been one of the best Terran players in 2012, had he was called like a third-rate Terran by a bunch of people because he wasn't from KeSPA. As it turned out, he'd do a very good run, and then he'd win that WCS season again over Jaedong, right? And in another sense, there's guys like MVP who like he did beat Rain. He gave like Innovation the best comeback game we'd ever seen in StarCraft 2 history before like his spine fell out basically. MMA, he'd make a comeback. MC, still very good. Hero still had some legs on him, and Parting, one of the best Protoss we'd ever seen. And then obviously it doesn't even account for like the three prodigies that end up coming out: Life, Tasia, Maru. All of them before KeSPA, all of them reached their peak before joining. And it's arguable with Mario because he had only won an OSL before joining KeSPA. And obviously I think KeSPA helped him among those three the most. Tasia never played. Life, I'm going to go ahead and say I don't think he learned much from KeSPA. I think that was just all him. As for the rest of it, where was I going with this? Oh, basically the another impact of this narrative of the elephant in the room is that everything before KeSPA comes is like some kind of farce, like as in it doesn't count, as in it wasn't like a highly competitive era. But as the later results show, there were like a bunch of competitive players, and you see them in like the not in their primes even, but in like the downslide of their careers, and they're still taking games, still taking series, still taking tournaments away from a bunch of KeSPA pros. So you have Polt, Bomber, MC, MMA, Parting, Life, and then guess what? There's going to be like prodigies who actually define. Actually, in my opinion, in the KeSPA era, the two best players were Tasia and Life, and neither of them were really part of the KeSPA system. So I kind of made that I think the rise of those two players actually convinced me anyway that if you are truly like genius level talent, like one in like a billion or whatever it is, and it doesn't really matter how much training or how much resources are put into the other players, you're still going to get yours. You're still going to be one of the best in the world ever. And definitely the case with Tasia and Life. So this narrative is important to talk about just because it's going to play into a lot of the ideas going into these Korean and foreigner pros' heads as we head into the heart of the storm. All right, I'll see you guys later.